There is a very specific kind of dread that just kind of washes over you when you're handed a massive, dense PDF of new regulatory
Oh,
text.
absolutely. That sinking feeling in your stomach.
Right. It's that realization of, like, wait, everything my security team has built over the last 3 years might suddenly be legally insufficient.
Yeah, and you're just staring down the barrel of having to start entirely from scratch.
Exactly. And we are looking right at that feeling today, and honestly, we're dismantling it. So, welcome to this deep dive. Our focus today is cybersecurity compliance. Specifically, we are demystifying Part 3 of the California Privacy Protection Agency's new CCPA cybersecurity audit
Which
regulations.
is a mouthful, I know.
It really is. But our mission for you today is straightforward. We're going to prove that while these rules sound incredibly daunting on paper, you actually don't have to start from square one.
Not if you know how to leverage your existing security frameworks anyway.
Exactly. And to help us navigate this, and a massive thank you to our sponsors making this deep dive possible, www.cisomarketplace.com and www.compliancehub.wiki.
Great resources, by the way.
Oh, totally essential. Because as we get into the actual implementation mechanics today, having tools like those to map your frameworks and actually source the right tools, it's critical for surviving this whole regulatory environment.
It really is.
So let's just get right into it. When people look at the CCPA audit requirements, they see California privacy law, and they immediately assume this apocalyptic scenario for their compliance budget.
Yeah, the panic is definitely out there, but, it mostly stems from a misunderstanding of how regulators actually construct these frameworks.
Right. They didn't just like invent a new standard out of nowhere.
Exactly. CalPrivacy didn't invent a new security paradigm out of thin air. They built on top of existing structures.
Right.
If your organization knows how to leverage its current security frameworks, the foundation is, it's already poured. The challenge is in building the house.
It's more about the plumbing. Right.
Yeah, it's understanding the specific, highly scrutinized way California wants you to inspect that plumbing.
Which means we really need to understand the structural logic behind these rules. Because U.S. data security regulation has historically been, well, kind of a mess.
Up a total mess.
And to understand why CalPrivacy wrote these specific mandates, we have to look at the failures of the previous eras.
Oh.
We all know the headaches of the reasonable security era.
Right, trying to guess what the FTC or auditors consider appropriate until you're literally already dealing with a breach.
Exactly.
That ambiguity is really the defining characteristic of the first wave of U.S. cyber law. Frameworks leaning on reasonable security, like HIPAA or GLBA, they intentionally keep things flexible.
Which makes sense in theory.
It does. The standard dictates that you have to implement measures appropriate for the size of your business and, the sensitivity of the data.
Right, because a regional credit union shouldn't be held to the same standard as, like, a hyperscaler cloud provider.
Exactly. That sounds incredibly rational. But from a purely mechanical standpoint, vagueness is a regulator's worst enemy when a breach actually happens.
But you can't penalize a company for failing a standard you never defined.
Exactly. The courts just end up completely clogged with arguments over whether a specific missing control was reasonable to omit.
So the pendulum swings entirely the other way. States got tired of arguing in court and just started issuing strict mandates.
Right, the second wave. State regulators, like in New York with the Department of Financial Services or up in Massachusetts, they shifted to a prescriptive approach.
They just abandoned the flexible standards.
Completely. They went for rigid, concrete checklists.
Yeah.
Their legislation dictates highly specific technical and administrative controls.
Like mandating you have to appoint a CISO, right?
Yeah, mandating a qualified CISO, requiring strict multi-factor authentication across specific surfaces, dictating the exact cadence of your penetration testing.
See, my issue with the prescriptive approach is that it treats security like building code. It's the equivalent of a city council mandating that every single homeowner must install a moat and a drawbridge, even if they just live in a third-floor apartment.
That is a perfect analogy.
Right. It gives you absolute clarity on what to buy, but it ignores the actual operational reality. You end up spending budget on controls that don't even align with your threat model.
And it creates a massive technical debt problem, too. When you mandate a specific technology by law, you lock organizations into compliance with tools that might be obsolete, like a year later.
But you still have to implement it just to check the box for the auditor.
Exactly. So recognizing how much the industry absolutely despised those rigid checklists, we got a third wave. The carrot, not the stick approach.
Like in Ohio and Utah, right?
Yeah, they introduced this affirmative defense model. They don't mandate any specific program. But if a business voluntarily adopts a recognized framework like NIST CSF or ISO 2701, the state provides a legal shield.
So they cap punitive damages if you get breached. Okay, so we've got the vague reasonable security, the rigid moat and drawbridge checklists, and the voluntary safe harbor carrot.
Right.
So where does the CCPA fit into the spectrum? Is it the carrot, the stick, or the moat?
Well, it functions as a hybrid. It leans heavily back into the reasonable security camp, but it comes with a highly structured enforcement mechanism.
Okay, so flexibility is still the focus.
The flexibility and risk-based judgment are the core focus, yes. However, CalPrivacy added a mandate requiring organizations to formally evaluate 18 specific program components.
Ah, okay, so it's more concrete than older reasonable security laws.
Much more concrete and auditable, but it deliberately avoids the brittle, tech-specific mandates of that prescriptive era.
Got it. But because it's still rooted in that reasonable security philosophy, a lot of businesses are looking at their recent ISO or NIST audits, and, they're assuming they can just hand that paperwork over to California and call it a day.
And that is a very dangerous assumption.
Yeah, the data in the sources paints a totally different picture. CalPrivacy's own estimates say that leveraging an existing framework like NIST or ISO only reduces your CCPA compliance costs by about 30%.
I know, it sounds crazy.
Wait, if I already did a massive ISO audit, which takes months, you're telling me I still have 70% of the homework left?
What's fascinating here is the concept of the audit lens. You have to look at the mechanics of what an ISO audit actually evaluates.
Okay.
A standard IT security audit looks at your systems through an enterprise risk lens. The goal is to protect the organization's ability to function.
Right.
But the CCPA audit requires you to look at your systems exclusively through the lens of the California consumer's personal information.
Oh, wow. That subtle shift completely changes the scope.
Dramatically.
Yeah.
We call this the process of topping off. You must map your existing framework audits to the CCPA requirements and then supplement the massive gaps in scope.
Let's visualize that mapping process, because it sounds a bit like auditing a bank vault versus auditing the individual safety deposit boxes inside.
Yes, exactly.
Like, your ISO audit proves the vault walls are thick, the biometric locks work, and the guards are awake. That's the enterprise risk.
Right.
But the CCPA auditor walks in and says, I don't care about the vault. I want to know exactly what happens when someone opens deposit box number 402, where that data goes, and who looked at it.
That is the exact mechanical difference. If your NIST audit covered your internal corporate network, but excluded the third-party marketing cloud where you actually process the consumer data.
Oh, no.
Yeah, your existing audit is virtually useless for CCPA compliance until you expand its scope.
Because it cares about where the data lives externally.
Exactly. And furthermore, you have to reconcile the time periods. If your ISO audit evaluated a 6-month snapshot, but CalPrivacy requires a trailing 12 months, you have a temporal gap.
Which means entirely new evidence collection. And finding those spatial and temporal gaps manually across hundreds of controls, that's where compliance teams just burn out.
Oh, they absolutely do.
Which is a great reminder, honestly. If you are sitting there trying to figure out how to overlay your NIST matrices onto these California rules, www.compliancehub.wiki is an invaluable tool to check out.
For automating that crosswalk, absolutely.
Yeah, because trying to manage that multidimensional mapping in spreadsheets, that is a recipe for missing a massive compliance gap.
Well, the mapping phase really determines whether the audit succeeds or fails. And what you are physically mapping those frameworks against is CalPrivacy's list of 18 cybersecurity program components.
Okay, let's unpack this list of 18 components. Because when security leaders see a numbered list from a state regulator, the psychological reaction is instantly, oh, this is a pass-fail checklist.
They assume if they miss component 14, they fail the whole audit and face enforcement.
Exactly. So is that true? Is this a mandatory checklist?
No, and that is a fundamental misreading of the regulatory text. The phrase governing all 18 components is if applicable.
Oh, thank goodness.
Right. This is not a rigid mandate to implement 18 specific technologies. The auditor only assesses the components that are materially relevant to your specific information systems and your risk profile.
That is a massive relief. But how does that actually play out in the documentation? because early drafts of the regulations were terrifying.
They were.
They wanted businesses to write down a detailed explanation for why they chose not to implement certain components. Like, if I decided encryption wasn't applicable, I had to formally document my lack of encryption.
Yeah, and industry commenters successfully pushed back on that.
Yeah.
They pointed out the obvious danger forcing companies to document every control they omitted basically generates a prepackaged roadmap of vulnerabilities for threat actors.
Right. Here's a list of exactly what we don't protect.
Exactly. CalPrivacy recognized that risk and deleted the requirement. You still have to make thoughtful, risk-based decisions on what's applicable, but you are no longer forced to publish your internal reasoning for omitting a control.
That's so practical. And when you look at the specifics of the 18 components, that operational practicality really shows. Let's look at authentication. Component 1.
Okay.
In previous eras, regulators would have just mandated complex, rotating passwords for everyone.
But here, CalPrivacy wrote the password subcomponent to apply only if the business actually utilizes passwords.
Wait, really? So if you've gone passwordless...
If you've shifted to entirely passwordless authentication using FIDO2 keys or biometrics, you are not penalized for failing to maintain a strong password policy.
Wow, so you aren't forced to resurrect legacy systems just to check a box.
Exactly. They also demonstrated restraint by completely removing zero-trust architecture as a standalone evaluation point in the final rules.
Which makes sense since zero trust is a philosophy, not like a software switch you flip. Let's shift to incident response, component 17. Because every SOC has alerts firing constantly.
Nonstop.
If my firewall blocks 1 million automated SQL injections a day, does the CCPA require me to audit my response to 1 million security incidents?
This is where CalPrivacy made another crucial revision. They narrowed the definition of a security incident. It specifies that the threat to personal information must be imminent rather than merely potential.
Oh, wow. That changes the entire operational burden.
It saves you from having to document your response to every low-level telemetry blip. It restricts the auditor's focus to near-term concrete threats.
So an automated script hitting the firewall and dropping that's potential?
Right, and it doesn't need to consume resources in your CCPA audit. But if a threat actor is inside an internal subnet trying to pivot to the consumer database, that's imminent.
Got it. And what about the human element? Component 12 and 13, updated training and awareness, and it feels like a direct shot at legacy compliance culture.
It really is. In the drafts, training and awareness were lumped together. Now they are entirely separate evaluation points.
Because making someone click through a 30-minute phishing video in January doesn't mean they're secure in November.
Exactly. CalPrivacy drew a hard line. Education is the baseline, teaching what a phishing email looks like.
Yeah.
Awareness is operational.
How are you maintaining that knowledge throughout the year, right?
Right. Are you actively updating the workforce on new tactics? A static annual module doesn't satisfy the requirement anymore. They want a continuous awareness culture.
And finding the right tools to execute all this, whether it's phishing-resistant MFA or audit log management for Component 7, it can be so tough.
It's an exhausting procurement process.
Which is exactly why we highlight www.cisomarketplace.com. Having a central hub to source the exact solutions for these specific components takes the guesswork out of building your stack.
It lets your team focus on the architecture instead of endless vendor research.
Because the architecture is what the auditor will actually test. Which brings us to the execution phase. We need a practical 4-step roadmap to actually do this without getting in trouble.
Right. Step 1 is the inventory phase. Gather those recent NIST or ISO assessments you already have.
Okay.
Step 2 is where the friction happens. RIA-scoping for the CCPA lens. Crucially, looking at third-party cloud environments.
Now, I have to push back here. If my company hosts its database in AWS, I don't own the underlying infrastructure. How can California expect me to audit Jeff Bezos' servers?
They don't. This comes down to the shared responsibility model.
Yeah.
You aren't auditing the hypervisor. You are auditing your configuration of the cloud environment. Most businesses fail because they assume the cloud provider's SOC2 report covers their CCPA compliance. It doesn't.
Because the auditor looks at how my team configured the access management.
Exactly. The access, the encryption keys, the API gateways. If consumer data flows through it, your configuration is in scope.
Which leads right into step 3, mapping that scope to the 18 components to find the gaps and topping off.
And step 4, ensuring independence and gathering evidence.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Evidence. Traditional compliance artifacts aren't going to cut it anymore, right?
No. We are moving from point-in-time verification to continuous assurance. A lot of companies used to rely on written policies or screenshots of dashboards to prove a control was active.
But a screenshot just proves the setting was turned on for 1 second on a Tuesday.
Exactly. It doesn't prove it worked all year. Regulators want system-generated logs and continuous telemetry. They need an audit trail.
If you bring a folder of screenshots, the audit instantly collapses.
Totally. And that scrutiny carries a deeply personal risk. The governance requirements hold a massive trap for the executive suite.
The perjury trap.
Yes. The CCPA requires an executive to sign off on the final audit, but they must swear under penalty of perjury that the business didn't try to influence or coerce the auditor.
Under penalty of perjury, that is terrifying. It's no longer just a rubber stamp signature.
The personal exposure is immense. If a CISO pressures the audit team to ignore a massive gap because it's too expensive to fix and the executive signs it, they've committed perjury.
It shifts the whole mindset from we need to look perfectly secure to we cannot lie about our vulnerabilities.
It forces brutal honesty up to the board level.
Wow. Okay, so summarizing this deep dive, CCPA audits don't mean starting from scratch. It's about taking the frameworks you already have, meticulously mapping them to CalPrivacy's 18 components, expanding the scope to external environments, and ensuring your evidence is bulletproof system logs, not screenshots.
And protecting the absolute independence of the audit.
So your executive doesn't walk into a perjury trap. Huge thank you again to our sponsors, www.cisomarketplace.com and www.compliancehub.wiki, for fueling this essential conversation for you all today.
But, before we go, I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder.
I'll lay it on us.
Think about Component 17, the incident response requirement. It mandates a structured record of all your California breach notifications.
Right.
Now, combine that history with an unvarnished, legally mandated list of all your vulnerability gaps across the other 17 components.
Oh, no.
If everything is neatly packaged in this single CCPA audit report, isn't this essentially creating a pre-written golden roadmap for opposing counsel in future class action lawsuits?
Wow. The very document keeping you compliant might dismantle your defense in court. That is something to think about. Good luck out there and stay secure.